There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They knock on your door cloaked in the mundane. A Tuesday night, a borrowed cup of sugar, a sudden downpour. You do not recognize them as architects of your future. You see only the rain, or the empty sugar bowl, or the familiar face of a friend. You do not feel the subtle shift in the tectonic plates of your existence until much, much later, when you are standing in the rubble of your old life, trying to remember the precise sound the first crack made. For me, that sound was a knock on my apartment door, punctuated by the frantic drumming of a summer storm against the glass of my living room window. It was Caleb, of course. In the geography of my small world, most unexpected arrivals mapped back to him. I opened the door, and the storm seemed to rush inside, a gust of wind carrying the scent of ozone and wet asphalt. He stood on my welcome mat, a silhouette against the flickering, waterlogged lights of the hallway. He was drenched, not just damp, not merely caught in a shower, but thoroughly, biblically soaked. Rainwater dripped from the ends of his dark hair, tracing paths down his temples and jaw. His gray t-shirt was plastered to his chest, turning a deep, bruised charcoal and revealing the sharp, familiar lines of his collarbones and the solid shape of his shoulders. He was shivering, a fine, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through him like a current. He wasn't looking at me, not directly. His gaze was fixed somewhere over my shoulder, aimed at the warm, dry sanctuary of my apartment. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the storm raging outside and the frantic, useless thumping of my own heart against my ribs, a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. I was a photographer. I spent my life observing, cataloging the minute details of the world from a safe distance, framing moments in a viewfinder to understand them. And in that moment, I was cataloging him. The way the hallway light caught the water on his eyelashes, making them look like tiny, glistening thorns. The faint blue of his lips. The way his hands were clenched into loose fists at his sides, as if holding onto the last vestiges of his composure. He looked like a man who had been shipwrecked and had just, by some miracle, washed ashore. My shore. Caleb, I finally managed, my voice sounding rough and unused. He blinked, and his focus finally shifted, landing on me. His eyes were wide, a little lost. It was the look he'd had for the past 3 months, ever since Amelia had left, but tonight it was amplified, diluted by rain and exhaustion into something raw and unguarded. He looked younger than his 29 years, stripped of the easy confidence he usually wore like a well-fitted jacket. "My boiler's out," he said, and his voice was a low rasp, barely audible over the thunder. "No hot water. I was walking. Just walking. Got caught." "Come in," I said, the words automatic, a reflex. I stepped back, pulling the door wider. It was an invitation I had extended 100 times before, but this time felt different. This time, the space between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, before he shuffled inside. He brought the cold and the storm in with him. A small puddle began to form around his worn sneakers on my hardwood floor. He stood there awkwardly, dripping, hugging himself as another shiver racked his frame. He looked profoundly out of place in the quiet order of my apartment, a chaotic element introduced into a controlled environment. "You're freezing," I stated, the observer in me noting the obvious. "You need to get out of those clothes. I'll get you a towel. And some sweats or something." I moved through my own space as if in a dream, my actions feeling both hyper-focused and strangely detached. I grabbed the thickest towel I owned from the linen closet, the one reserved for guests who rarely materialized. I pulled a soft, worn pair of gray sweatpants and an old university hoodie from my drawer, clothes that would be loose on me and just right on his broader frame. I was functioning on autopilot, my mind a frantic scramble of practicalities, a desperate attempt to avoid thinking about the reality of the situation. Caleb, broken and cold, was in my home. He had come to me. When I returned to the living room, he had peeled off his soaked t-shirt. It lay in a sad, puddled heap on the floor. And I stopped. I just stopped, rooted to the spot a few feet away from him, the clean clothes clutched in my hands. His back was to me. The soft light from my reading lamp traced the elegant architecture of his spine, the sweep of his shoulder blades, the faint constellation of moles scattered across his skin. I had seen him shirtless before, at the pool, at the beach with mutual friends. It had always been in the bright, open, desexualized light of day, surrounded by other people. This was different. This was the dim, intimate light of my home. It was private. My gaze felt like a trespass, like a touch. My breath hitched. He must have heard the sound, or perhaps he just sensed my stillness. He turned his head, looking at me over his shoulder. The movement was slow, weary. The shivering was more pronounced now, his skin pebbled with goosebumps. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet, vulnerable. It was just my name, but it felt like a question, a plea, and an apology all at once. I finally moved, closing the distance between us and holding out the clothes. "Here, go get changed. In the bathroom. I'll make some tea." He took the clothes from me, his cold fingers brushing against mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through me, a spark of heat that was almost painful in its intensity. He didn't immediately move toward the bathroom. He just stood there, holding my clothes, looking at me with those exhausted, rain-washed eyes. "Thanks," he murmured. Then he added, so quietly I almost missed it, "I'm sorry to just show up." "Don't be stupid," I said, my tone softer than I intended. "It's what neighbors are for. Go." He finally gave a small, defeated nod and disappeared into my bathroom, closing the door softly behind him. I stood alone in my living room, the silence now feeling immense, cavernous. I could hear the whisper of the shower starting, the sound a strange intrusion of domesticity. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my own body trembling slightly in the aftermath of the encounter. I looked at the puddle on my floor, at the discarded gray shirt. It was just water. It was just a shirt, but it felt like evidence, a sign that a boundary had been breached, that the carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart had been tested. I went to the kitchen and filled the kettle, my hands not quite steady. I focused on the task, the familiar ritual of it. Measuring the tea leaves, finding his favorite mug, a sturdy, plain white one he'd left here weeks ago, and placing it on the counter. My mind was a storm of its own, mirroring the one outside. I was replaying the image of his back, the feel of his cold fingers, the sound of my name on his lips. I was trying to frame it, to put it in a box I could understand. Was this just friendship? Was this just a man in need seeking shelter from a friend? Or was it something more? The hope was a dangerous, insidious thing, a weed growing in the cracks of my carefully ordered life. He emerged from the bathroom a few minutes later, looking warmer, softer. He was wrapped in my clothes. My old hoodie, my comfortable sweats. On him, they looked different. They looked right. He had towel-dried his hair, but it was still damp, curling slightly at his nape. He looked less like a shipwreck survivor and more like someone who simply belonged here. The sight did something strange to my chest, a painful, pleasant tightening. He padded into the kitchen and leaned against the counter opposite me, wrapping his hands around the warm mug of tea I pushed toward him. He took a sip, closing his eyes for a moment as the warmth spread through him. "Better?" I asked. He nodded, opening his eyes. They were clearer now. "Much. Thank you, Leo. Seriously, you're a lifesaver." "Anytime," I said, and I meant it more than he could possibly know. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of the thunder. This was our usual dynamic. We could exist in silence together without it feeling awkward. It was one of the things I treasured most about our friendship. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was filled with the ghost of his shivering, the image of his bare skin, the unspoken reason for his 3-month-long sadness. He finally spoke, his voice low. "It's stupid. The boiler. It's just one more thing, you know? One more thing that's broken." I knew he wasn't just talking about the boiler. I heard the echo of Amelia's name in his words. I just nodded, leaning against the counter beside him, giving him the space to talk if he wanted to. "Everything feels broken," he continued, staring down into his mug. My apartment feels wrong. Empty. Too quiet. Or too loud. I don't know. I couldn't be there tonight. I had to get out. So I started walking. And then the rain started. And I just kept walking. I think I wanted to get washed away. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Didn't work. Just got cold. My heart ached for him. It was an old, familiar ache. The one I felt every time I saw the pain he tried so hard to hide behind his easy smile and his busy social life. I wanted to reach out, to put a hand on his arm, to offer some physical comfort. But I didn't. I couldn't. My touch would not be neutral. It would be loaded with years of unspoken affection, and I was terrified he would feel the weight of it. So I stayed still, a fixed point of stillness for him to orbit. "You can stay here," I said, the offer leaving my lips before I had fully formed the thought. "On the couch. If you don't want to be alone." He looked up at me, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, so profound it was almost heartbreaking. "You sure? I don't want to impose." "It's not imposing, Caleb. The couch is comfortable. You've fallen asleep on it enough times." It was true. In the weeks since his breakup, our movie nights had often ended with him passed out on my sofa, me quietly draping a blanket over him before retreating to my own bed, my apartment filled with the quiet sound of his breathing. He managed a small, grateful smile. "Okay, thanks." Later, after the storm had quieted to a gentle, steady patter against the windows, I set him up on the couch. I gave him the good pillow from my bed and my warmest blanket, a heavy wool one. He settled in, looking small and lost among the cushions. I stood there for a moment, hesitating in the doorway of the living room. "Good night, Leo," he said, his voice already thick with sleep. "Good night, Caleb," I replied softly and turned to go to my room. I was almost at my bedroom door when his voice stopped me, quiet but clear in the still apartment. "Leo?" I turned back. He had pushed himself up on one elbow, the blanket pulled around his waist. In the dim light, his face was all shadows and vulnerability. "I'm still. I'm so cold," he said. It wasn't a complaint. It was a simple, desperate statement of fact. The shivering had returned, a tremor in his voice, in the line of his shoulders. "It's like it's in my bones. I can't get warm." And then came the moment. The moment disguised as a simple, logical request, born of cold and loneliness. The moment that would become the cornerstone of a new, terrifying, beautiful architecture between us. He looked at me, his gaze direct and pleading. I read somewhere an article about hypothermia. An old army medic wrote it. He swallowed, his throat working. Said warmth works better skin to skin. The words hung in the air between us. They were heavier than a simple sentence. They were a key, offered to a door I had long assumed was permanently locked. A door I was terrified to open. My mind went blank, and then it flooded. Every rational thought was screaming at me. "No, this is dangerous. He's lonely. He's grieving. He doesn't mean it like that. You will break your own heart." But my heart was already broken, in a way. It had been living with a hairline fracture for years, a quiet, chronic ache of loving him from a distance. He was just cold. He was my friend. He needed help. That was the story I could tell myself. That was the plausible deniability I could cling to. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I simply walked back to the couch. I didn't turn on a light. I didn't ask questions. I pulled back the other side of the heavy wool blanket and slid under it, my back to him. The space felt enormous, a chasm of unspoken meaning. I lay there, ramrod straight, my muscles screaming with tension, my breath held tight in my chest. I was acutely aware of him behind me, of the heat his body was radiating, a small sun in the cold expanse of the night. For a full minute, nothing happened. I could hear his breathing, unsteady and shallow. I could feel his indecision. Then, slowly, tentatively, he shifted. He moved closer, inch by agonizing inch, until his chest was pressed against my back. He was still wearing my hoodie, and I was in a t-shirt, so it wasn't skin to skin. Not yet, but it was close enough. The warmth of him seeped through the layers of cotton, a profound, shocking heat that seemed to sink directly into my bones, chasing away a chill I hadn't even realized I was carrying. His arm came around my waist, his hand resting hesitantly on my stomach. His touch was light, questioning. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just let out a slow, shaky breath. It was a breath of surrender. In response, his arm tightened, just slightly, pulling me more securely against him. He tucked his face into the space between my shoulder blades, and I felt his cold nose press against my shirt, followed by the warm puff of his breath. The shivering that had racked his body began to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering sigh of relief that I felt through my entire torso. And that's how he fell asleep, him holding me from behind, me lying perfectly still, terrified that the frantic, joyful, terrified beating of my heart would give everything away. It was not a beginning I could have ever predicted. It was just a response to a storm, a broken boiler, and a quiet, desperate confession of cold. It was a moment disguised as something ordinary, and it changed everything. To understand the weight of that night, you have to understand the years that came before it. You have to understand the foundation of our friendship, a structure I had meticulously, carefully built to house my affection without ever letting it show. Caleb and I had been neighbors for 4 years. I moved into apartment 5B first, drawn by the huge north-facing windows that flooded the space with the perfect, diffuse light for my photography work. My life was a quiet one, a curated collection of solitude, books, and the chemical scent of the darkroom I'd built in my spare bathroom. I knew my neighbors by the sounds they made, the classical music from the elderly woman below, the frantic scrabbling of the small dog across the hall. I was content in my bubble. Then Caleb moved into 5A. He did not arrive quietly. He arrived with a flurry of friends, loud laughter, the clatter of boxes, and the scent of pizza. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of social energy that seemed fundamentally at odds with the sleepy quiet of our floor. My first real interaction with him was 2 days after he moved in. He knocked on my door, holding an empty, sheepish-looking mug. He was all bright eyes and an easy, disarming smile. He was wearing a faded band t-shirt that I recognized, and his hair was a mess, as if he'd been running his hands through it all morning. "Hey," he'd said, that smile widening. "Total cliché, I know, but any chance I could borrow some coffee? My stuff is still in a state of chaos that defies the laws of physics." I remember just staring at him for a second, momentarily stunned by the sheer, unadulterated charisma radiating from him. He was like a sunbeam in my perpetually overcast world. I mumbled something about having beans, but not grounds, and he just laughed. "Even better," he'd said. "A man of taste. I'm Caleb, by the way." "Leo," I'd replied, and the name felt small and plain in the face of his vibrancy. That was the beginning. Our friendship wasn't built on grand gestures, but on a slow accumulation of small, mundane kindnesses. He'd bring me a container of whatever elaborate meal he'd cooked, claiming he'd made too much. I'd water his jungle of houseplants when his consulting job took him out of town for a week. We discovered a shared love for old sci-fi films and terrible B-movies, which led to movie nights, first in his apartment, then more often in mine, because my couch was more comfortable and I didn't mind him leaving his sock on the floor. He was an open book, or so it seemed. He talked about his job, his frustrations with coding, his sprawling family in another state. He talked about Amelia, his girlfriend at the time, with an easy, comfortable affection. They'd been together since college, a fact that seemed to root him, to give him a solid center. He was everything I wasn't. Extroverted, effortlessly social, seemingly unafraid of taking up space in the world. I was the quiet observer, the one who listened, who watched. My apartment became a kind of neutral ground for him, a quiet harbor where he could dock when the seas of his own life got choppy. He'd come over after a long trip, exhausted and jet-lagged, and just sit in my armchair, not talking, just decompressing in the silence. For my part, I was guarded. I shared details about my work, about the abstract concepts I was trying to capture in my photos. I talked about books and music. But the core of me, the part that was tangled up with loneliness and a deep, abiding yearning, I kept hidden. I locked it away, especially the part that was about him. The feelings had started early. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was more like a slow developing photograph in my darkroom, an image gradually emerging from the chemical bath. At first, it was just an appreciation for his physical presence, the way he'd lean in the doorway, all long limbs and relaxed energy, the sound of his laugh, a deep, genuine rumble. Then it deepened. I started to see the things beneath the surface. I saw the flicker of insecurity in his eyes when a work project went wrong. I saw the profound loyalty he had to his friends. I saw the gentleness with which he tended to his ridiculous number of plants. I fell in love not with the sunbeam, but with the man who cast the light. I hid it, of course. I hid it so well I sometimes convinced myself it wasn't there. He was my friend. He was my best friend. And he was straight. He had a girlfriend he loved. My feelings were a complication, a bug in the code of our easy friendship. To reveal them would be to risk everything. It would be selfish. It would ruin the one connection that made my quiet life feel less lonely. So I channeled it into my art. He became my unwitting subject. I have a whole series of photographs from those years, filed away in a box labeled Studies in Light. There are photos of his hand resting on a coffee mug, the late afternoon sun catching the fine hairs on his knuckles. There's a shot of the back of his neck, taken from my balcony as he stood on his, talking on the phone. There's a blurry, abstract image of his silhouette moving past my living room window. I was documenting my love in a language he would never understand. I was telling the whole story to a world that couldn't hear it. It was my way of being honest without ever taking a risk. So when Amelia left him, it felt like an earthquake. He called me from a business trip in Chicago, his voice hollowed out. She had packed her things and moved out of the apartment they had shared for 2 years, the one just a few neighborhoods over. She'd left a note. A note. After 8 years together. The cruelty of it stunned me. When he got back to town, he didn't go to his own apartment. He came straight to mine. He stood in my doorway, his suitcase next to him, looking utterly shattered. He didn't cry. He just looked at me, his face pale, and said, "She's gone." That was the shift. That was the catalyst. The reliable ground beneath his feet had vanished, and he was in free fall. My apartment, my quiet, stable presence, became his anchor. The movie nights became more frequent. The silences between us grew longer, but they were heavier now, filled with his grief. He started falling asleep on my couch almost every night. I'd find him there in the morning, curled up, looking vulnerable in a way I'd never seen him before. I would make coffee and wait for him to wake up, my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't name. It was a fusion of deep, protective pity and the selfish, terrible hope that his need for comfort might, just might, make a space for me. I hated myself for that hope. I felt like a vulture, circling his heartbreak. But it was there, a persistent, quiet hum beneath the surface of my sympathy. He was in pain, and all I wanted to do was hold him. But I was his friend, his straight friend. So I made him tea. I let him use my laundry detergent. I listened when he needed to talk, and I sat in silence with him when he didn't. I maintained the boundaries. I kept the architecture of our friendship intact, even as the foundation of his own life was crumbling. And then came the storm, and the broken boiler, and the shivering, and that one, simple, devastating sentence about skin and warmth. He had crossed a line I had never dared to approach. He had walked right through a door I had kept triple-bolted from my side. And I, in my cowardice and my desperate hope, had simply let him. I had pretended I didn't know what it meant. The morning after that first night was an exercise in excruciating awkwardness. I woke up slowly, my body stiff from lying in one position for hours. The first thing I registered was the warmth. The solid, living heat of Caleb's body still pressed against my back. His arm was still around my waist, his hand resting loosely on my hip. His breathing was deep and even, the soft puff of it a steady rhythm against my shoulder blade. For a few blissful, hazy seconds, I simply existed in that moment. It was a fantasy made real, a dream I had never allowed myself to have, playing out in the pale morning light filtering through my blinds. The world was quiet. There was no storm, no broken boiler, no grieving ex-girlfriend. There was only this warmth, this closeness. Then, reality came crashing in. My mind snapped into focus, and with it came a tidal wave of anxiety. What did this mean? What was he thinking? What would happen when he woke up? I was trapped. I couldn't move without waking him, and I couldn't bear the thought of the moment his eyes opened and he registered where he was, who he was holding. Would he pull away in disgust? Would he laugh it off as a weird, desperate thing he did because he was cold? Would he look at me with pity? The possibilities were a gallery of my worst fears. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, a prisoner of his embrace. I catalogued every sensation: the weight of his arm, the texture of his sweatpants against the back of my legs, the faint, clean scent of my own soap on his skin. It was a torturous kind of heaven. I was getting everything I had ever wanted, but it was on borrowed time, under false pretenses. It felt like theft. Eventually, I felt him begin to stir. A subtle shift, a deeper breath. His hand on my hip tensed for a second, then relaxed. He made a low, sleepy sound in the back of his throat. And then he went still. I could feel the moment his consciousness returned. I could feel the awareness ripple through him, the dawning realization of our position. I braced myself. He didn't pull away. Instead, he burrowed his face a little deeper into my back, his arm tightening almost imperceptibly. He let out a long, slow sigh, a sound of pure, unadulterated comfort, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if he had woken up like this 1,000 times before. My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, seemed to stop altogether. It was a reaction I hadn't prepared for. Acceptance. Contentment. After another long minute, he finally, slowly, loosened his grip. He slid his arm from around me and shifted away, creating a few inches of cool air between our bodies. The loss of his warmth was immediate and acute. I heard him sit up, the couch cushions sighing under his weight. I kept my eyes closed, feigning sleep. It was a coward's move, but I couldn't face him. Not yet. I heard him stand up and pad quietly out of the room. A few moments later, the scent of coffee began to fill the apartment. He was making coffee. In my kitchen, after sleeping in my arms. The domesticity of it was so staggering, so at odds with the frantic chaos in my own head, that I almost laughed. When I finally summoned the courage to wake up, I found him sitting at my small kitchen table, staring into a mug, my discarded hoodie now hanging on the back of his chair. He was wearing just the sweatpants, his chest bare. He didn't seem to notice or care. He looked thoughtful, his brow furrowed slightly. He glanced up as I walked in, and his expression was unreadable. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't embarrassed. It was just quiet. "Morning," he said, his voice a little rough. "I made coffee." "I see that," I replied, my own voice betraying none of my inner turmoil. I was a master of the neutral tone. I poured myself a mug, my back to him, using the simple action to gather myself. "Sleep okay?" I asked, my voice casual. Too casual. He was quiet for a moment. I turned to face him, leaning against the counter. He was looking at me, his gaze steady. "Yeah," he said, and the word was imbued with a surprising amount of sincerity. "Yeah, I slept better than I have in months. I was warm." He said the last word without any particular emphasis, but it landed like a stone in the quiet kitchen. Warm. He was giving me the out. He was reinforcing the pretext. He was cold, and now he was warm. End of story. It was a clean, simple narrative that explained everything away, that protected our friendship from the messy truth of what had happened. It was a gift, in a way, a chance to pretend. And so began the ritual. It didn't happen every night, at first, but it happened often. Caleb would come over, we'd watch a movie or just talk, and eventually, he would end up on my couch. The pretext was always there, a silent, flimsy shield. Sometimes it was explicit. "God, my apartment is like an icebox tonight." Other times, it was just an unspoken understanding. I would get up to go to bed, and he would look at me with that lost, tired expression, and I would know. I would get the blanket, and I would lie down, and he would curl up behind me, his arms sliding around my waist, his face tucking into my back. We never spoke of it in the morning. We never acknowledged it at all. It was a secret we kept together, in the dark. In the daylight, we were just Leo and Caleb. Friends. Neighbors. But at night, we were something else. We were two bodies sharing warmth, two lonely people finding a temporary harbor in each other. For him, I told myself, it was about comfort. It was a human hot water bottle, a replacement for the casual intimacy he had lost. For me, it was a slow, sweet torture. My life began to revolve around this ritual. My nights were filled with a state of hyper-awareness. I learned the topography of his sleeping form. I learned that he sometimes kicked in his sleep, that he mumbled things I could never quite make out. I learned the exact weight of his head on my shoulder when he shifted in the middle of the night. I would lie awake for hours, just listening to him breathe, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my back. My own apartment, my sanctuary of solitude, was no longer just mine. It was saturated with him. His scent lingered on my pillows. His toothbrush, a bright blue one, appeared in the holder next to mine one day, without comment from either of us. A silent declaration of permanence. I was living a double life. In one, I was the calm, supportive friend. In the other, I was a man drowning in unspoken love, my body a nightly offering on the altar of his grief. The anxiety was a constant companion. Every night, I would wonder if this was the night he would stop, the night he would realize what he was doing, or the night he would simply not need the comfort anymore. Every time he came over, I felt a jolt of hope and fear. Every time he stayed, it was a relief and a renewal of the exquisite agony. My photography suffered. I couldn't focus. The world outside my apartment seemed gray and distant. The only thing that felt real, the only thing I wanted to capture, was the warmth of him in the dark, the feeling of his hand on my stomach, the quiet intimacy of our shared breath. But that was a moment I could never frame, never capture. It was too fragile, too dangerous. It existed only in the space between us, in the unspoken agreement we had made. He was getting better, in small increments. The raw, shattered look in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a more familiar, calmer sadness. He started talking about the future again, about new projects at work, about maybe taking a trip. And with every sign of his healing, a cold dread filled me. I was happy for him, truly. I wanted him to be whole again. But I was terrified that a healed Caleb would no longer need me. Our ritual was born of his brokenness. What would happen when he was no longer broken? Would he just stop coming over? Would he look back on these months with embarrassment, a strange chapter he'd rather forget? The plausible deniability that had once been my shield now felt like a prison. He was cold. He was lonely. He needed a friend. These were the simple, acceptable reasons. But as the weeks turned into months, they started to feel thin. The ritual had become too established, too normal. The way he would find my hand in his sleep and lace his fingers through mine. The way he would sometimes press a soft, sleepy kiss to my shoulder blade before drifting off. These were not the actions of a man who was just cold. Or maybe they were. Maybe I was projecting my own desperate desires onto innocent, unconscious gestures. The ambiguity was killing me. I was living in the gray space, the twilight between friendship and something more, and the uncertainty was hollowing me out. One night, the ritual changed. He had come over late, after being out with some work friends. He was sober, but tired, his social energy completely depleted. He didn't even bother with the pretense of a movie. He just walked in, kicked off his shoes, and headed for the couch. I followed, my heart doing its usual nervous flutter. I pulled the blanket from the back of the armchair and went to lie down in my usual spot. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I stopped, confused. No. He was sitting on the edge of the couch, looking at the space I was about to occupy. Not like that tonight. He looked up at me, and his expression was different. It wasn't sad or lost. It was intentional. "Turn around," he said softly. My breath caught. "What?" "Turn around, Leo. Face me." It was a simple command, but it felt monumental. It was a demand to break the cardinal rule of our ritual. We never faced each other. Facing each other meant there was no place to hide. Facing each other meant looking into each other's eyes. It meant acknowledging the other person. I stood there, frozen, the blanket clutched in my hand. "Caleb, please," he whispered. And I was lost. I had never been able to deny him anything. Slowly, My limbs feeling like they were moving through water, I lay down on the couch. And I turned to face him. He lay down opposite me, pulling the blanket over both of us. We were inches apart. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I could see the faint scar above his eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd told me about once. I could feel his breath on my face. The silence was deafening. There was no pretext here. There was no plausible deniability. We were two men, lying on a couch, staring at each other in the dim light of a quiet apartment. The air was thick with 3 months of unspoken things. My heart was a drum, so loud I was sure he could hear it. He lifted a hand, his movements slow, deliberate. He brushed a stray piece of hair from my forehead. His fingers were warm against my skin. The touch was electric, 1,000 times more potent than any of the touches that had come before, because this one was conscious. This one was wide awake. "Leo," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes searched mine, and I saw a universe of confusion, fear, and a terrifying, dawning certainty. He was no longer the unknowing initiator. He knew. In that moment, he knew exactly what he was doing. He leaned in, closing the small gap between us. His gaze dropped to my mouth. And then he asked the question that shattered the beautiful, fragile, agonizing world we had built. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his lips almost touching mine. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" Time stopped. The question hung in the air, a perfect, crystalline thing. It was not a proposition. It was a confession. It was an admission that this ritual, our strange and silent nightly communion, had never been just about the cold. It was permission. He was asking for permission to name the thing that had been living in the dark with us for months. My mind, usually a frantic hive of overanalysis, went completely, blessedly silent. There were no more scenarios to run, no more interpretations to debate. There was only his question and the answer that had been lodged in my throat for 4 years. I didn't say yes. I couldn't form the word. I simply closed my eyes. It was a surrender. It was my own confession. It was all the answer he needed. His lips met mine. It was not a passionate, cinematic kiss. It was impossibly, breathtakingly gentle. It was tentative, soft, a question in itself. It was just the barest pressure, a warm, hesitant exploration. It tasted of coffee and mint and a deep, underlying sweetness that was just Caleb. It was the most honest thing that had ever passed between us. All the unspoken words, all the secret yearning, all the fear and hope and confusion, it was all there in that one, quiet touch. It was a beginning and an ending all at once. The end of the pretending, the beginning of, I didn't know what. He pulled back after a few seconds, just an inch, his forehead resting against mine. His eyes were still closed. I opened mine. I saw the tremor in his eyelids, the slight parting of his lips as he breathed. He wasn't the confident, easygoing Caleb from next door. He was someone new, someone as vulnerable and terrified as I was. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than to me. It was a sound of discovery, like he had found the answer to a question he hadn't even known he was asking. He kissed me again, and this time it was with a little more certainty. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking gently along my cheekbone. It was a gesture of such profound tenderness it made my chest ache. I lifted my own hand, my movements clumsy, and rested it on his chest, right over his heart. I could feel it beating, a frantic, rapid rhythm that matched my own. We were in sync. For the first time, we were perfectly, terrifyingly in sync. We didn't talk. There were no words that could contain the magnitude of what was happening. We just stayed there, on my couch, wrapped in the same blanket that had been our shield for so long, and we kissed. Slow, searching kisses that were less about desire and more about discovery. It felt like learning a new language, a language my body had known how to speak all along, but had never been allowed to use. I was memorizing the shape of his lips, the faint rasp of his evening stubble, the way he sighed into my mouth. I was taking a photograph with my senses, burning the moment into my memory so it could never fade. Eventually, the kisses slowed, and we just held each other, face to face, our legs tangled together. His arm was a warm, heavy weight around me, holding me close, as if he were afraid I might disappear. My hand was still on his chest, my fingers spread wide, anchoring myself to him. He tucked his head into the crook of my neck, and I felt his breath, warm and steady, against my skin. "Leo," he murmured against my throat. "I'm here," I whispered back. He was quiet for a long time. I thought he might have fallen asleep. But then he spoke again, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. I didn't know," he said. I knew what he meant. He didn't know he was capable of this. He didn't know he felt this way. He was a man who had lived his life on a clearly marked map, and he had just walked off the edge of it. "It's okay," I said, stroking his hair. The gesture felt new, and yet completely natural. "Is it?" he asked, his voice small, laced with a genuine, deep-seated confusion. "I feel like I'm going crazy. For months, coming over here, I just told myself I was lonely, that I missed, just having someone there. But it was more than that. It was you. It was always you." My heart seized. It was the one thing I had never, ever allowed myself to hope for. That it wasn't just about comfort. That it was about me. He pulled his head back to look at me, his eyes dark and serious in the dim light. "This whole time, you've been so patient. So good to me. You just let me take what I needed. You never asked for anything," he swallowed. "Have you? Did you know that this was what I needed?" The question was a minefield. How could I answer that? "Yes, Caleb, I've been in love with you for 4 years. I knew exactly what you needed because it's what I've been starving for." The truth felt too large, too overwhelming. It would be like turning on a floodlight in a dark room. It would expose everything, and maybe ruin the delicate image that was just starting to develop between us. "I knew you needed a friend," I said carefully, choosing my words like stepping stones across a rushing river. "And I knew you needed to not be alone." It was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. He seemed to accept it, though. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping. He looked down at my hand on his chest, and he covered it with his own, his fingers lacing through mine. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. Don't go to your room tonight. Just stay here. I'm not going anywhere," I promised. And I didn't. We fell asleep like that, face to face, our hands clasped together between us, our breath mingling in the small space we had carved out for ourselves. For the first time in months, I didn't lie awake with anxiety. The uncertainty had vanished, replaced by a fragile, terrifying, beautiful certainty. I fell asleep feeling his heartbeat under my palm, and for the first time in a very, very long time, my own heart felt whole. I didn't know what the morning would bring. I didn't know what we were. But for one night, I was not just the quiet observer. I was part of the scene. I was home. The peace, of course, was a fragile thing. A bubble of impossible beauty that was destined to burst. The morning after the kiss was not like the mornings that had come before. It was not filled with the comfortable, unspoken understanding of our ritual. It was filled with a thick, suffocating silence. I woke first. We were still tangled together, his leg thrown over mine, his arm draped across my waist. My face was pressed against his chest, and the steady, slow rhythm of his heart was the first sound I heard. For a moment, a wave of pure joy washed over me. This was real. Last night was real. But then I opened my eyes, and I saw the gray, unforgiving light of dawn, and the anxiety returned, colder and sharper than before. Last night was a confession in the dark. What would it be in the light of day? I didn't have to wait long to find out. Caleb stirred, and I felt him tense. It was the same way he'd tensed that very first morning, the moment of dawning awareness. But this time, it wasn't followed by a sigh of contentment. It was followed by a sharp, sudden withdrawal. He pulled his arm and leg away as if he'd been burned. He sat bolt upright, scrubbing a hand over his face, his back to me. The space he left behind was instantly, shockingly cold. "Caleb," I whispered, my voice small. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at me. He just swung his legs off the couch and stood up, running his hands through his already messy hair. He started pacing the small confines of my living room, a caged animal. He wouldn't look at me. "I have to go," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any of the warmth or vulnerability of the night before. "What?" The word was a punch to the gut. "Caleb, what's wrong?" Nothing's wrong, he said, the lie so blatant it was insulting. I have an early meeting. I forgot. I have to go. He was already gathering his things, his phone, his keys, the clothes from the night before that I had washed and folded for him. He was moving with a frantic, desperate energy, an energy designed to avoid stillness, to avoid thought, to avoid looking at me. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me. It felt like a flimsy shield against the sudden iciness in the room. Caleb, stop. Talk to me. He finally stopped his frantic movements and looked at me, and the expression on his face broke my heart all over again. It was a look of pure, panicked confusion. He looked trapped. He looked terrified, and he was looking at me as if I was the source of that terror. I can't, he said, shaking his head. I can't do this, Leo. This isn't. I'm not. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to name the thing he was not. You're not what? I pressed, my voice quiet but firm. My hurt was beginning to curdle into a cold, hard knot of anger. You're not the one who kissed me? You're not the one who asked if it was okay? You're not the one who said it was always me? Each question was a soft blow, and I saw him flinch. I was confused, he said, his voice dropping to a low, miserable mumble. I'm still grieving. I'm not thinking straight. Last night it was a mistake. A mistake. The word echoed in the silent apartment. After all the nights, all the unspoken intimacy, all the shared warmth, it was all reduced to a mistake. A moment of confusion born from grief. I had been a placeholder after all. A warm body. A comfort object. The hope that had bloomed in my chest last night withered and died, turning to ash. A mistake, I repeated, my voice flat. I felt strangely calm, a hollow sort of calm that comes after the worst has happened. So all of this. I gestured around the living room, at the couch, at the blanket. For the last 3 months, that was a mistake too. No, he said, his voice rising in frustration. That was different. We were friends. I was lonely. And what were we last night, Caleb? I asked, and my voice finally cracked. What were we when you were kissing me? What were we when you fell asleep in my arms? Were we just friends then, too? He had no answer. He just stood there, looking at me with wide, haunted eyes. He looked like a man who had just woken up in a foreign country with no idea how he had gotten there. I have to go, he whispered again, and this time he didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed his things and practically fled from my apartment, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft, final click. I was left alone in the wreckage. The silence he left behind was absolute. I sat on the couch, the blanket still wrapped around me, the indent of his body still warm beside me. The scent of him was everywhere. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot who had built a palace out of a pile of sand, only to be surprised when the tide came in and washed it all away. The pain was sharp and blinding, worse than the chronic ache of my secret love had ever been. This was the pain of rejection, the pain of being seen and then discarded. The days that followed were a special kind of hell, a silent hell. Caleb avoided me. If I saw him in the hallway, he would find a sudden, urgent reason to look at his phone, or he would give me a tight, brief nod and hurry past. The door to apartment 5A, which had so often been left ajar, was now perpetually, firmly shut. The silence from his apartment was different now. It wasn't the empty silence of a man who was away on business. It was an active, deliberate silence. A wall he had built between us. I was a wreck. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I certainly couldn't work. I would stand in my darkroom for hours, staring at the blank paper, the chemical baths, unable to create anything. The world had lost its color, its texture. Everything felt flat and meaningless. My apartment, my sanctuary, felt like a prison. Every corner of it held a memory of him. The couch was a monument to my own stupidity. The white mug on the drying rack was a taunt. After 4 days of this agonizing silence, something in me snapped. The hurt and the misery finally coalesced into a single, hard point of resolve. I could not live like this. I could not live in the apartment next to the ghost of what had almost been. I could not live with the word mistake hanging over my head. I deserved more than that. Our friendship, even if that's all it ever was, deserved more than that. It deserved a better ending than a panicked flight and a slammed door. That evening, I walked out of my apartment and knocked on the door of 5A. My heart was hammering, but my hands were steady. I was done being the passive observer. I was done waiting for him to figure himself out. It took him a long time to answer. I could hear him moving around inside, the soft footfalls hesitating behind the door. Finally, the lock clicked and the door opened a few inches. He peered out at me, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Good. Leo," he said, his voice wary. "Are you going to let me in, or are we going to have this conversation in the hallway?" I asked, my tone even, devoid of accusation. He hesitated for a second, then sighed and opened the door wider. I stepped inside. His apartment was a mess. Clothes were strewn on a chair. Takeout containers were piled on the coffee table. The air was stale. His beautiful, thriving plants were starting to wilt. It was the apartment of a man who had lost his anchor all over again. He didn't invite me to sit. He just stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. "What do you want, Leo?" he asked. I took a deep breath. "I want you to be honest with me. No more running. No more, I was confused. I want the real, unvarnished truth." "What happened?" He looked away, staring at a spot on the wall. "I told you. It was a mistake." "No," I said, taking a step closer. "Look at me, Caleb." He reluctantly met my gaze. "A mistake is knocking over a glass of water. A mistake is taking the wrong turn on the freeway. You don't spend 3 months sleeping in someone's arms by mistake. You don't kiss someone like you kissed me by mistake. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. You made a choice. And then you got scared." He flinched, and I knew I had hit a nerve. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. "Don't I?" I challenged, my voice rising slightly. "I have been sitting in the front row of the Caleb Show for 4 years. I know you. I know you build these perfect, orderly structures in your life. The good job, the perfect girlfriend, the easy friendships, because you are terrified of the mess inside. Amelia leaving didn't just break your heart, it broke your system. And you came to me, because I'm quiet and I'm stable and I'm safe. And you used my safety to fall apart in. And I let you. I let you because I care about you. I almost said it. Because I'm in love with you." The words were right there, on the tip of my tongue. But I held them back. This wasn't about my feelings. This was about his. "And somewhere in that mess," I continued, my voice softening, "you found something else. Something you weren't expecting to find. And it terrified you. Because it doesn't fit in your system. It doesn't fit on your map. So you're trying to pretend it doesn't exist. You're trying to erase it. And you're trying to erase me along with it. And I won't let you do that." Tears were welling in his eyes. He looked utterly broken. "I don't know who I am, Leo," he whispered, his voice cracking. "All my life, I've been one thing. And now this. With you. It felt more real than anything. And that scares the hell out of me. What if it's not real? What if I'm just so broken that I'm latching onto the first kind person I see? What if I'm just using you? I couldn't live with that. Ruining you, ruining our friendship. I can't do that to you." And there it was. The confession, not of love, but of fear. A deep, profound fear of his own feelings, and a fear of hurting me. It wasn't about me being a mistake. It was about him being afraid that he was the mistake. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. I closed the remaining distance between us, and, for the first time, I was the one who initiated the touch. I placed my hands on his shoulders. He was trembling. "You think you're protecting me by running away?" I asked softly. "Caleb, you are destroying me. The silence is 1,000 times more painful than the confusion. The only way you can hurt me now is by lying to me, or by lying to yourself." I looked at him, at his tear-streaked, terrified face. "I don't have all the answers," I said. "I'm scared too. But we can't find the answers if you're on this side of the hall, and I'm on mine. We can't build anything from opposite sides of a locked door." He finally broke. A sob escaped him, and he collapsed against me, burying his face in my shoulder. His arms came around me, holding on tight, like a drowning man clinging to a raft. I held him back, my own arms wrapping around his shaking frame. I wasn't a comfort object anymore. I wasn't a placeholder. I was just Leo, and he was just Caleb. And we were a mess. A beautiful, terrifying, hopeful mess. And for the first time, we were in it together. There was no magical, instantaneous resolution. Our conversation in his messy apartment didn't fix everything, but it did something more important. It opened the door. Not just the physical door to his apartment, but the emotional one he had slammed shut. It was the beginning of a new kind of work, the slow, painstaking process of clearing the rubble and seeing what, if anything, could be built on the fractured foundation. He didn't stay at my place that night. We just stood in his living room, holding each other, until his sobs subsided into shaky breaths. It was a different kind of holding than before. It wasn't the desperate, unconscious seeking of warmth in the dark. It was a conscious, mutual support. Two people holding each other up. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "I'm sorry," he whispered. It was the most sincere apology I had ever heard. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry, too. For pushing you." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You didn't push. You refused to let me fall. I think I needed that." We stood in a new kind of silence for a moment, one that wasn't empty or awkward, but filled with a fragile, nascent understanding. I need some time to think, Leo," he said. "To just sit with this. By myself." A flicker of the old fear went through me. But I looked at his face, and I saw that this wasn't a retreat. It was a regrouping. He wasn't running away from me. He was trying to figure out how to walk toward me. "Okay," I said, and I meant it. "Take your time." "But Caleb," I waited until he met my eyes. "No more silence. Even if you're confused, even if you're scared, just talk to me. Send me a stupid text. Knock on my door and say you have nothing to say. Just don't disappear again." A small, watery smile touched his lips. "I won't. I promise." And he kept that promise. The next few weeks were a strange, delicate dance. We started over in a way. We went back to the beginning, but with all the cards on the table. He would text me in the middle of the day, "Just thinking about what you said." Or, "My head is a mess today." And I would text back, "That's okay. Mine too." Or, "Want to get out of your head for a bit?" Terrible sci-fi movie marathon. We started spending time together again, but it was different. It was intentional. We went for walks. We sat on our shared balcony, talking for hours. He told me about his childhood, about the pressures from his family to follow a certain path. He talked about his relationship with Amelia, about the slow, quiet way it had eroded over the years, until it was just a habit they were both afraid to break. He was deconstructing his own life, piece by piece, and showing me the architecture of his fears. And I, in turn, began to let him in. I showed him the box of photographs, the studies in light. I pulled them out one evening, my hands trembling slightly, and spread them on my coffee table. He looked at them for a long time, in silence. He picked up the photo of his hand on the coffee mug, the one where the light was so perfect. He traced the line of his own knuckles in the picture. "You saw all this?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "All this time, you were seeing me." "I always saw you, Caleb," I said quietly. "Even when you couldn't see yourself." There was no more sleeping on the couch. There was no more ritual of borrowed warmth. The ambiguity was gone, and in its place was a terrifying, exhilarating honesty. We were relearning how to be with each other. We were building a new kind of intimacy, one based not on need and plausible deniability, but on choice and open communication. The first time he stayed over again, it was about a month after our confrontation. We had spent the evening cooking dinner together in my kitchen, a comfortable, domestic chaos of chopping vegetables and bumping elbows. After we ate, we sat on the couch, a safe, platonic foot of space between us, and talked until late. When it was time to go to bed, a familiar tension settled in the room. He was the one who broke it. He turned to me, his expression open and a little nervous. "Can I stay tonight?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "The couch is—" "No," he interrupted softly. "Not the couch." He looked toward my bedroom door. "Can I stay with you?" It was the same question as before, but the context was entirely different. This wasn't a plea born of cold or loneliness. This was a request, a choice. I just nodded, unable to speak. That night, we lay in my bed, face to face, just as we had on that one fateful night on the couch. But this time, there was no fear. There was no confusion. He reached for my hand in the dark, and his fingers laced through mine. It wasn't a sleepy, unconscious gesture. It was a deliberate act of connection. "Is this okay?" he whispered, echoing the words that had started it all. "It's more than okay," I whispered back. He kissed me then, and it was like coming home. It was a kiss of reassurance, of promise. It was quiet, and it was certain. We didn't make love. We just held each other, our hands clasped between us, and for the first time, we talked. We whispered our fears and our hopes into the darkness. We mapped out the new, uncharted territory of US. From that night on, a new normal began to settle over us, as quiet and gentle as a morning fog. He started staying over more often than not. His toothbrush was joined by a bottle of his shampoo in my shower. His favorite coffee mug was no longer a visitor. It lived in my cupboard. His wilting plants migrated to my apartment, where I could help him nurse them back to health under the good light of my north-facing windows. My quiet, solitary space became our space. It didn't feel like an invasion. It felt like an expansion. My world had grown to make room for him, and it was brighter, warmer, more alive. The door between our apartments, 5A and 5B, took on a new meaning. It was no longer a barrier. It was just a threshold. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would wake up and find him gone, and a momentary panic would seize me. But then I would hear him moving around in his own apartment, getting a glass of water or just pacing, and I would relax. He wasn't running away. He was just existing, in his space and in mine. We had two homes, and we had one. One morning, I woke up to find him standing by my window, looking out at the city. He was wearing my old university hoodie, the one he'd worn that first night. He was holding my camera. He turned it over in his hands, studying it. "You know," he said, not looking at me, "I never understood what you were doing with this. All these pictures of things, shadows and hands and empty rooms. I thought they were beautiful, but I didn't get it." He turned to look at me, and he smiled. It was his old, easy smile, but it was different now. It reached his eyes. It was deeper, more genuine. "I get it now," he said. "You're not just taking a picture of the thing. You're taking a picture of the light that's on it. You're showing us how to see it." He walked over to the bed and sat on the edge, placing the camera carefully on the nightstand. He leaned down and kissed me, a soft, lazy morning kiss. "Thank you," he whispered against my lips, "for showing me how to see." We found our resolution not in a grand declaration, but in the accumulation of these quiet moments. In the shared task of making coffee in the morning. In the comfortable silence of reading side by side on the couch. In the way he would reach for my hand when we walked down the street. Our love story wasn't a storm. It was the quiet, steady, life-giving rain that comes after. It was the slow, careful process of two people learning to heal, learning to trust, and building a home for each other in the beautiful, honest silence they had learned to create together. The door wasn't open or closed anymore. It was simply gone. There was no longer a my place or your place. There was only here. There was only us.